This is America Daily, bringing you the best in truthful news updates and in-depth reports happening now.
Welcome to America Daily. I'm Jessica Beatty. This week, we're talking about the global sexual revolution and how it has impacted our society. In the previous episodes in this series, we focused on the sexual revolution in the United States and how it was largely based on Alfred Kinsey's fraudulent research. But the United States is just one piece of the puzzle. Today's episode explains the role communism played in the global sexual revolution, with examples from the Soviet Union, China, and the United States. Here's America Daily's Mark Jackson reading from the Epoch Times special series called How the Specter of Communism is Ruling Our World. This is from Chapter 7, The Destruction of the Family.
Communism's aim to eliminate the family. Communism believes that the family is a form of private ownership. To eliminate private ownership, therefore, it follows that the family should also be eliminated. The original principle of communism regards economic factors to be key in determining the kind of family relationships formed. Contemporary Marxian Freudianism regards sexual desire as the key to questions associated with the family. The common characteristic of these two ideologies is their casting aside of basic human morality, their worship of materialism, desire, and pragmatic interests. All of this simply turns humans into beasts. It is a twisted ideology that has the effect of destroying the family by corrupting thought. The fantastic delusion that sits at the heart of communism is the doctrine of the liberation of mankind. This manifests not merely as supposed liberation in an economic sense, but also the liberation of mankind itself. The opposite of liberation, of course, is oppression. So where does the oppression that must be resisted come from? Communism's answer is that the oppression comes from people's own notions, which are imposed by traditional social morality. The patriarchy of the traditional family structure oppresses women, traditional sexual morality oppressed human nature, and so on. The feminism and homosexual rights movements of later generations inherited and then expanded upon this communist-inspired theory of liberation. It leads to a full battery of concepts in opposition to traditional marriage and family, as well as sexual liberation, homosexuality, and the like. All of these ideas have become tools used by the devil to undermine and destroy the family. Communism sets itself against and wishes to overthrow all traditional moral values, as clearly stated in the Communist Manifesto. 3. Communism's promotion of promiscuity. The communist evil specter sets itself against the traditional family, which it wants to destroy. Early in the 19th century, Robert Owen, a representative of utopian socialism, sowed the seeds of the devil's ideology. A communist ideological pioneer, Owen established the utopian community New Harmony in Indiana in 1824. It failed 2 years later. On the day the community was established, he declared, quote, "I now declare to you and to the world that man, up to this hour, has been, in all parts of the earth, a slave to a trinity of the most monstrous evils that could be combined to inflict mental and physical evil upon his whole race. I refer to private or individual property, absurd and irrational systems of religion, and marriage, founded on individual property combined with some one of these irrational systems of religion." After Owen died, another influential utopian communist was the Frenchman Charles Fourier, whose thoughts deeply influenced Marx and Marxists. After his death, his disciples brought his thoughts into the Revolution of 1848 and the Paris Commune, and later spread them to the United States. Fourier first coined the term feminist, féminisme in French. In his ideal communist society, called the Phalanx, the traditional family was scorned, and bacchanals and orgies were praised as fully liberating human inner passions. He also declared that a fair society should take care of those who are sexually rejected, such as the elderly or unattractive, to ensure that everyone has the right to sexual gratification. He believed that any form of sexual gratification, including sadomasochism, where one person inflicts pain on the other person, and even incest and bestiality, should be allowed as long as it's consensual. Fourier, therefore, can be regarded as the pioneer of queer theory, a branch of the contemporary homosexual movement, including LGBTQ and the like. Because of the influence of Owen, and especially of Fourier, dozens of communist utopian communes were set up in the United States in the 19th century, though most were short-lived and ended in failure. The longest was the Oneida Commune, established on the basis of Fourier's theory, which lasted 32 years. The commune despised traditional monogamous marriages and advocated polygamy and group sex. Members got a, quote, fair sexual access by being allotted the opportunity each week to have sex with anyone of their choosing. In the end, the founder, John Humphrey Noyes, fled for fear of a lawsuit by the church. The commune was forced to abandon wife-sharing, though Noyes later wrote books and became the originator of Bible communism. Communism's promiscuous gene is an inevitable consequence of its theoretical development. From the very beginning, the demon of communism tempted people to abandon godly teachings, to deny the divine, and to deny original sin. According to this logic, social problems originally caused by the degeneration of human morality were attributed to private ownership. Communism leads people to believe that if private property is destroyed, people will not fight over it. However, even if all property is shared, people might also have conflicts over their spouses. Therefore, utopian socialists openly use a system of wife-sharing to solve such problems inherent in human nature. These communist, quote, paradises either directly challenged the traditional family or advocated a system of common wives, which led local communities, churches, and governments to see them as a challenge to traditional morality and ethics, and take action to suppress them. The scandalous communist sharing of wealth and wives became widely known. The failure of utopian communes taught Marx and Engels a lesson. It was not yet the time to openly advocate promiscuous wife-sharing. Although the goal of eliminating the family in the Communist Manifesto had not changed, they adopted a more concealed approach to putting forward their theories and destroying families. After the death of Marx, Engels published the book The Origin of the Family, Private Property, and the State, in the light of the researches of Lewis H. Morgan, to complete Marx's theory on the family and further expound the Marxian view of marriage. Quote, the emergence of monogamy is based on the supremacy of the man, the express purpose being to produce children of undisputed paternity. Such paternity is demanded because these children are later to come into their father's property as his natural heirs. It is distinguished from pairing marriage by the much greater strength of the marriage tie, which can no longer be dissolved at either partner's wish. Engels argued that monogamy was based around private property, and that once all property is shared, there would be a brand new model of marriage based purely on love. Superficially, it sounds so noble, but it is not. The attempted defenses of Marx and Engels seem feeble in light of the actual implementation of communist theory. Feelings are unreliable. If a person loves someone today and another person tomorrow, does that not encourage promiscuity? The promiscuity that took place after the establishment of the former Soviet Union and the Chinese Communist regime, which will be discussed in the following section, is in fact the result of applied Marxist doctrine. Relationships between husbands and wives aren't always smooth sailing. The vow, "till death do us part," during a traditional wedding, is a vow to God. It also represents the idea that both parties are prepared to face and overcome all hardships together. What maintains a marriage is not merely emotion or feelings, but also a sense of responsibility. Treating one's other half, the children, and the family with care transforms both the husband and wife into a mature man and woman with a sense of moral responsibility. Marx and Engels boasted in The Origin of the Family, Private Property, and the State that in a communist society, private property becomes public, housework becomes professionalized, There's no need to worry about looking after children since it's the country's responsibility to take care of and educate the children. They wrote, quote, "This removes all the anxiety about the consequences, which today is the most essential social, moral, as well as economic factor that prevents a girl from giving herself completely to the man she loves. Will not that suffice to bring about the gradual growth of unconstrained sexual intercourse, and with it a more tolerant public opinion in regard to a maiden's honor and a woman's shame?" What Marx and Engels promoted, even though using the phrases freedom, liberation, and love to conceal the fact, was nothing more than the complete abandonment of personal moral responsibility. They encouraged people to act solely on their desires. However, during Marx's era, and that of Fourier, most people had not abandoned godly teachings entirely and were wary of communism's promotion of promiscuity. Yet even Marx himself could hardly have imagined the rationalizations that people would come up with in the 20th century and following to embrace the sexual chaos of Marx's thought and press forward the goal of eliminating the family. The Red Demon arranged certain individuals to sow the seeds of paying too much attention to sex and deviance. It also systematically arranged for luring people to follow their desires and oppose godly teachings so as to gradually deprave them, until finally achieving the goal of eliminating the family. This ultimately brings about the deviation of the human heart and leads people to fall into the devil's grasp. 4. The practice of wife-sharing under communism. The sexual chaos described above is an innate part of communism. Marx is believed to have raped his maid and had Engels raise the child. Engels cohabitated with 2 sisters. Lenin carried out an extramarital affair with a woman named Inessa for 10 years and also committed adultery with a French woman. He also contracted syphilis, consorting with prostitutes. Stalin was equally lustful and is known to have taken advantage of other people's wives. After the Soviets seized power, they instituted the practice of wife-sharing. The Soviet Union at the time can be viewed as the pioneer of sexual liberation in the West. In the 10th edition of the Russian magazine Rodina, printed in 1990, the phenomenon of wife-sharing during early Soviet rule was exposed. The piece also described the private lives of Soviet leaders Trotsky, Bukharin, Antonov, Kollontai, and others, saying that they were as casual as dogs in their sexual activities. A. Wife-sharing in the Soviet Union. As early as 1904, Lenin wrote, quote, "Lust can emancipate the energy of the spirit, not for pseudo-family values, but for the victory of socialism must this blood clot be done away with." At a meeting of the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party, Leon Trotsky proposed that once the Bolsheviks seized power, new fundamental principles of sexual relations would be drafted. Communist theory demands the destruction of the family and the transition to a period of unconstrained satisfaction of sexual desire. Trotsky also said that the responsibility to educate children resides solely with the state. In a letter to Lenin in 1911, Trotsky wrote, quote, "Undoubtedly, sexual oppression is the main means of enslaving a person. While such oppression exists, there can be no question of real freedom. The family, like a bourgeois institution, has completely outlived itself. It is necessary to speak more about this to the workers." Lenin replied, quote, "And not only the family. All prohibitions relating to sexuality must be abolished. We have something to learn from the suffragettes. Even the ban on same-sex love should be lifted." After the Bolsheviks seized power, Lenin brought out a series of regulations effectively abolishing marriage and the punishment of homosexuality. At that time, there was also the slogan, quote, "Down with shame." This was part of the Bolshevik attempt to create the, quote, "new man" of socialist ideology, and sometimes even included roaming the streets naked and hysterically screaming slogans like, quote, "Shame is in the bourgeois past of the Soviet people." On December 19, 1918, to celebrate the commemoration day of the decree effectively abolishing marriage, lesbian groups celebrated. Trotsky writes in his memoirs, that the news of lesbians celebrating with a parade made Lenin very happy. Lenin also encouraged more people to march naked. In 1923, the Soviet novel The Loves of Three Generations popularized the word glass of waterism. The author, People's Commissar for Social Welfare Alexandra Kollontai, was a revolutionary who fought her way into the Bolshevik faction from a traditional family in search of women's liberation. The glass of waterism promoted by the novel is, in fact, a synonym for sexual indulgence. In communist society, satisfying sexual desire is as normal and easy as drinking a glass of water. Glass of waterism was widespread among factory workers and especially teenage students. The well-known communist Smitovich wrote in the Pravda newspaper, March 21, 1925, quote, "The current morality of our youth is summarized as follows. Every member, even a minor, of the Communist Youth League and every student of the Rabfak, Communist Party Training School, has the right to satisfy his sexual desire. This concept has become an axiom, and abstinence is considered a notion of bourgeois. If a man lusts after a young girl, whether she is a student, a worker, or even a school-age girl, then the girl must obey his lust, otherwise it will be considered a bourgeois daughter, unworthy to be called a true communist." Divorce also became normalized and widespread. Paul Kengor noted in his book, Takedown, From Communists to Progressives, how the left has sabotaged family and marriage. Quote, "The divorce rate skyrocketed to levels unseen in human history. In short order, it seemed as though everyone in Moscow had a divorce." In 1926, the influential American magazine, The Atlantic, published an article about the astonishing situation in the USSR with the title, quote, "The Russian Effort to Abolish Marriage." The phenomenon of Swedish families, which has nothing to do with Sweden, but refers to a large group of men and women living together and engaging in casual sex, also appeared during this period of sexual liberation. This opened the doors to promiscuity, sexual chaos, homosexuality, moral collapse, the destruction of families, sexually transmitted diseases, rape, and more. Following the expansion of socialist communes, these Swedish families spread across the Soviet Union. This was known as the nationalization or socialization of women. The socialist women in Yekaterinburg, March 1918, are a sad example. After the Bolsheviks seized the city, they issued an ordinance that young women between ages of 16 to 25 must be, quote, socialized. The order was implemented by several party officials, and 10 young women were socialized. The Bolsheviks quickly tightened their policies on sex at the end of the 1920s. During a conversation with feminist activist Clara Zetkin, Lenin deplored the glass of waterism philosophy, calling it anti-Marxist and anti-social. The reason was because sexual liberation brought about an undesirable byproduct, many newborn babies. Many were abandoned. Again, it was shown that the destruction of the family eventually results in societal collapse. B. Sexual liberation in Yan'an. During the CCP's early years, the circumstances were similar to that of the Soviet Union. Of course, these communist parties are all varieties of poisonous fruits from the same tree. Chun Du-shi, an early communist leader, was known for his debauched personal life. According to the memoirs of Zheng Shaolin and Chun Bilian, Zhu Chuibai, Sai He-sen, Zhang Tailie, Xiang Jinyu, Pang Shouzhi, and others, they had a somewhat confused sexual history, and their attitude toward sex was similar to the glass of waterism of the early Soviet revolutionaries. Sexual liberation was embraced not only by the party's intellectual leaders, but also by ordinary people living in the CCP's early, quote, Soviets, revolutionary enclaves set up before the National Party was overthrown, in Hebei, Henan, and Anhui, due to the promotion of equality of women and absolute freedom of marriage and divorce. Revolutionary work was often disrupted in order to satisfy sexual desire. Young people in the Soviet areas sometimes engaged in romantic affairs in the name of connecting with the masses. It wasn't unusual for young women to have 6 or 7 sexual partners. according to the collection of revolutionary historical documents in the Hebei, Henan, Anhui Soviet districts, among local party chiefs in places like Hong'an, Huangma, Huangqi, Guangshan, and elsewhere, quote, about 3/4 of them kept sexual relations with dozens or hundreds of women. In late spring of 1931, when Zhang Guotao took charge of the Hebei, Henan, Anhui Soviet districts, he noted that syphilis was so widespread that he had to report to the Party Central for doctors who specialize in treating the disease. Many years later, in his memoirs, he still vividly recalled stories of women in the Soviet districts being sexually harassed, including some of the senior general's mistresses. In 1937, Li Kenong was serving as the director of the CCP's 8th Route Army office in Nanjing, making him responsible for collecting military stipends, medicine, and supplies. On one occasion, when checking the medicine list of the 8th Route Army, the national government staff found a large quantity of drugs for treating sexually transmitted disease. The staff asked Li Kenong, "Are there a lot of people in your army suffering from this disease?" Li wasn't sure what to say, so he lied and said it was to treat the local people. By the 1930s, however, sexual freedom came to be perceived as a threat to the regime. The same problem of social disintegration, found in Soviet Russia, was apparent, and Red Army conscripts began worrying that their wives would take up extramarital affairs or divorce them once they joined the revolution. This affected the combat effectiveness of the troops. Moreover, the trend of promiscuity seemed to reinforce the notoriety of the, quote, common property, common wives slogan. Thus, Soviet districts began implementing policies protecting military marriages, limiting the number of divorces, and more. 5. How Communism Destroys Families in the West. The evil spirit's ideological trends find their origins in the 19th century. After a century of transformation and evolution in the West, they finally came to the fore in the United States in the 1960s. In the 1960s, influenced and encouraged by neo-Marxism and various other radical ideologies, social and cultural movements manipulated by the evil spirit appeared. These include the hippie counterculture, the radical New Left, the feminist movement, and the sexual revolution. The turbulence of these social movements was a fierce attack against America's political system, traditional value system, and social fabric. The movements quickly spread through Europe, rapidly altering the way mainstream thought about society, the family, sex, and cultural values. While this was going on, the gay rights movement was also rising. The convergence of these forces led to the weakening of traditional Western family values and the decline of the institution of the traditional family and its centrality in social life. At the same time, social turmoil triggered a series of problems, including the proliferation of pornography, the spread of drug abuse, the collapse of sexual morality, the rise of juvenile crime rate, and the expansion of groups depending on social welfare. A. Promoting sexual liberation. Sexual liberation, also known as the sexual revolution, originated in the United States in the 1960s. Its subsequent rapid spread through the world dealt a devastating blow to traditional moral values, in particular traditional family values and sexual morality. The evil spirit made ample preparations for using sexual liberation against Western societies. The free love movement paved the way to gradually erode and disintegrate traditional family values. The concept of free love violates traditional sexual morality and argues that sexual activity of all forms should be free from social regulation. In this view, individual sexual activities, including marriage, abortion, and adultery, should not be restricted by the government or law, nor subject to social sanction. The followers of Charles Fourier and the Christian socialist John Humphrey Noyes were the first to coin the term free love. In recent times, the main promoters of free love ideas are almost all socialists or people deeply influenced by socialist thought. For example, among those pioneering the free love movement in Britain was socialist philosopher Edward Carpenter, who was also an early activist for gay rights. The gay rights movement's most famous advocate, British philosopher Bertrand Russell, was an avowed socialist and a member of the Fabian Society. He claimed that morality should not limit humanity's instinctive drive toward pleasure and advocated premarital and extramarital sex. The main forerunner of the free love movement in France was Émile Armand. In his early days, he was an anarcho-communist who later built on Fourier's utopian communism, founded French individualist anarchism, which falls under the broader category of socialism, and advocated promiscuity, homosexuality, and bisexuality. The pioneer of the free love movement in Australia was Chummy Fleming, an anarchist, another socialist offshoot. The free love movement in America bore important fruit. Playboy, the erotic magazine founded in 1953. The magazine made use of coated paper to create the impression that it was artistic and not seedy. It also used expensive color printing, with the result that pornographic content, typically regarded as low-class and vulgar, swiftly entered the mainstream, and Playboy became a high-class leisure magazine. For more than half a century, it has spread the toxin of sexual freedom to people around the world and has laid siege to traditional morals and perceptions regarding sex. In the middle of the 20th century, with hippie culture increasing in popularity and free love gaining widespread acceptance, the sexual revolution, also known as sexual liberation, made its official debut. The term sexual revolution was coined by Wilhelm Reich, the founder of communist psychoanalysis and a German communist. He combined Marxism with Freudian psychoanalysis and believed that the former liberated people from economic oppression, while the latter liberated people from sexual repression. Another founder of sexual liberation theory was Herbert Marcuse of the Frankfurt School. During the Western counterculture movement of the 1960s, his slogan, "Make love, not war," embedded the notion of sexual liberation deep within people's hearts. Since then, with the publication of Alfred Kinsey's Sexual Behavior in the Human Male and Sexual Behavior in the Human Female, and the widespread use of oral contraceptives, the notion of sexual liberation swept through the West. It is worth mentioning that contemporary scholars have discovered distorted statistical data in Kinsey's work, as well as exaggeration, oversimplification, and other fallacies driven by his political and ideological commitments. Kinsey set out to show that extramarital sex, homosexual sex, and so on were common, and thus to direct society to accept the normalization of these phenomena, a task at which he was largely successful.
The latest push to change our understanding about gender is yet another stage in the process. It's called gender mainstreaming, and global elites, as well as the media, have been subjecting us to a re-education process to get rid of the idea that there are only two genders. We can see this happening in our schools today. But that's a topic for another day. If you thought today's content was interesting, you can find the rest of the series, How the Specter of Communism is Ruling Our World, at the epochtimes.com. That's the Epoch, E-P-O-C-H, times.com. Once again, I'm Jessica Beatty. Thanks for listening to America Daily. Until next time.
This is America Daily, bringing you the best in truthful news updates and in-depth reports happening now.